Hi guys, and welcome to Terminal Velocity. Today is the first episode of the Zelda Versus series. The first two competitors are Twilight Princess and Four Swords Adventures. For the first category we're going to be ranking them on is creativity. Now, both of these games have pretty good creativity. And while it's harder to find the creativity in 2D games, Four Swords Adventures actually has a lot of creativity. From how the 4-player mode works, to how it connects with the Game Boy Advance as well as the GameCube, and how there are a bunch of different modes, and how the whole story isn't like a open world, it's different levels. In Twilight Princess, it has some creativity too, with new horse mechanics and a bunch of new features and some creative dungeons. But for this part, Four Swords Adventures gets the win. Next category we're going to be looking at is combat. Both of these games have very great combat. From Twilight Princess's different moves, such as the Helm Splitter, the spin attack, hero spin, tons of different new attacks, to Four Swords Adventures, which is one of the first 2D Zelda games to sort of have a 3D look to it. But the cool combat is the 4 players and how you can switch between different formations of the players, or just have them all follow each other. Also, the enemies, which we'll be talking about later, also contribute a lot to the combat, which is how Four Swords Adventures surprisingly gets another point. The next area is the important area of exploration. Now, Twilight Princess is not really well known for its exploration, but due to Four Swords Adventures levels and linearness, Twilight Princess gets a definite quick win in this battle. Next Zelda Versus category is items. Twilight Princess has one of the largest item inventories out of all Zelda games. And Four Swords Adventures doesn't have really any notable items, which is how Twilight Princess once again manages a quick victory. The next section we're ranking off of is enemies. There are a variety of really great enemies with their own set of ways to defeat them. In Four Swords Adventures, this isn't really shown as much as it is in Twilight Princess. And in general, 3D Zelda games have better enemies, which is why Twilight Princess once again gets the win. Next up, we have dungeons. This category is not well matched at all, as Twilight Princess has some of the best dungeons in the whole entire series, and Four Swords Adventures doesn't really have dungeons at all. So for this fact, Twilight Princess once again gets a win. The next section we have ranking is characters. Four Swords Adventures actually has pretty good characters. And although it's a 2D game with not that much to add to the canon, there are some characters that are important. However, Four Swords Adventures characters don't add up at all to the personality of Twilight Princess. The next thing I will be ranking these games on is story. And while you might think Twilight Princess has a far better story than Four Swords Adventures. Four Swords Adventures actually has a really good story, and maybe even one of the best 2D Zelda game stories. And while Twilight Princess's story is very similar to Ocarina of Time's, Four Swords Adventures takes its own story take by including the two main enemies of the Legend of Zelda series, Ganon and Vati. This is a new thing that has never happened in any games before this or after this. So that's why Four Swords Adventures gets the win in this category. The next category I'm going to be ranking these games on is emotion. This is another category where Twilight Princess by far surpasses Four Swords Adventures. Twilight Princess's emotion is very dark, and you can feel it whenever you're playing it by all of the dark tones and themes. Four Swords Adventures, on the other hand, doesn't really have too much emotion to add to its sort of cartoonish like 2D aspect. Which is how Twilight Princess once again gets a point in this category. The next aspect we're going to be ranking on is progression. This is one of the few categories where Four Swords Adventures starts out with a severe advantage to Twilight Princess. This is because 2D Zelda games generally have a lot better progression than 3D Zelda games. So we should take a look to see which one of them has better progression. Four Swords Adventures has levels that it's split into, and they each progressively get harder. While Twilight Princess is one large story where the difficulty kind of gets harder and easier as the time goes on. So, once again, Four Swords Adventures will get a point in this category. The next aspect we're going to be ranking on is side content. There's actually a good amount of side content in both of these games, with Twilight Princess having a lot of good side quests, and Four Swords Adventures having a few side quests, as well as really cool other modes to play in. However, Four Swords Adventures' other modes are far superior to Twilight Princess's side quests, which is how it gets a win in this category as well. The next aspect we're going to be ranking is music. Both of these games have a very varying soundtrack, with Twilight Princess's being more dark-toned to meet its dark themes, and Four Swords Adventures having a more happy, Wind Waker-like music soundtrack. However, Twilight Princess's fits a little better with the game, so Twilight Princess gets another win in this category. The next aspect we're going to be ranking is bosses. These are more of the harder enemies in the game that typically are in the very middle and end of dungeons. However, Ganon is also considered a boss. For these two games, Twilight Princess has very good dungeon bosses, while Four Swords Adventures has seriously good ending bosses. However, Four Swords Adventures are a little better considering it's 2D. So Four Swords Adventures gets another point in this category. The next category we're going to be ranking on is art style. You might think that Four Swords Adventures has a much better art style than Twilight Princess due to its cartoonish like art style. But Twilight Princess actually has a little better art style with its more realistic tone that was very cutting edge at the time when it was made. So that's how Twilight Princess gets a point in the art style category. The next category we're going to be ranking by is the world. While Four Swords Adventures world is very unique and creative, it is split into different levels, which makes it a lot smaller feeling and doesn't give as much exploration. However, Twilight Princess's world is very large and expansive, and it's one of the most creative out of all of the Zelda games, which is how Twilight Princess gets another point in this category. The next category is difficulty. Twilight Princess is known for being one of the easiest Legend of Zelda games. And Four Swords Adventures, despite it looking cartoony and not too difficult, is actually not that easy of a game, which is how Four Swords Adventures is a little more difficult than Twilight Princess. The final category we're going to be ranking by is replay value. This is how much value a game has to replay after already completing it once. Four Swords Adventures, although it is a very good game, is not nearly as fun to replay as Twilight Princess, likely due to its 2D nature and not as many creative things, which is how Twilight Princess has a little bit more replay value. When I was originally making this video, I thought it wouldn't be a very close match, as Four Swords Adventures isn't usually talked about too much among Zelda fans, while Twilight Princess is one of the most popular games. However, Four Swords Adventures, despite losing, still put up a pretty good fight against one of the largest Zelda games out there. Anyway, thanks for watching this video, and I hope you have a great Zelda month. Bye guys, I hope to see you again on Terminal Velocity.